This is Unit 1.3, Absolute and Comparative Advantage. Absolute advantage is the producer that can produce the most outputs or requires the least amount of inputs and resources to produce those things. For example, in the graphs down here, Bob makes 4 salads and 2 pastas. On the other hand, David can make 6 salads and 4 pastas. This means David has the absolute advantage for both salads and pasta because 6 is clearly greater than 4 and 4 is clearly greater than 2. However, on the other hand, comparative advantage is the producer with the lowest opportunity cost, meaning they will lose less of their next highest valued alternative while making the other item. Now, in this next example, between Brett and Joe making cakes and pies, we're going to figure out who was the absolute and comparative advantage in this situation, and what would be the best trade. Now, 10 and 15 for Brett's outputs can be simplified to 2 and 3. So now, when we set up our little chart here, when Brett makes 1 cake, and when Brett can make 1 pie, and Joe, when he makes 1 cake and 1 pie. So now it is time to find the absolute and comparative advantage between Brett and Joe. So based off of this graph, we can learn that for every 1 cake Brett makes, he makes 1.5 pies based off of the 3/2 fraction. And now we also know that for every 1 pie he makes 2/3 of a cake because of the 2/3. But now moving over to Joe, for every 1 cake he makes 0.8 of a pie because of 4/5. However, on the other hand, for every 1 pie he makes 1.25 of a cake based off of the 5/4 fraction. Now that we've done this comparison here, we will learn that Joe has the comparative advantage in cakes because his opportunity cost is much lower than Brett's 1.5. And on the other hand, we know Brett will have the comparative advantage in pies because his opportunity cost is only 2/3 of a cake. Now that we have figured out the comparative advantage, we will now figure out the trade beneficial for both people. So, Brett will focus on baking pies and will want to trade for cakes. This would mean he will want to trade pies for cakes at a higher rate than his opportunity cost of 2/3 and Joe's opportunity cost of 1.25. This would leave the acceptable term of trade to be 1 cake for 1 pie, mainly at Brett's gain, but it would leave both of them in a beneficial trade. This is because when it comes to the pies, 1 is in between 2/3 and 1.25. So that would mean a good in between is 1 for 1. Now what we're going to do is take the same thing from question number 3, but turn it into an input problem. So now instead of it being total outputs, it's going to be the inputs, how many hours it takes to make 1 cake or 1 pie. So based off of this, we can figure out that Brett has the absolute advantage in both cakes and pies because he takes the fewest amount of hours to create 1 cake and 1 pie. It only takes him 2 hours to make 1 cake when it takes Joe 5 hours to create 1 cake. And then only takes Brett 3 hours to make 1 pie, but it takes Joe 4 hours to make 1 pie. So overall, Brett has absolute advantage in both. Now, with comparative advantage, we're going to set up something very similar to what we did up there. So, just like this, 1 pie per cake, and then it's going to be for Brett, and then for Joe, it's going to be same setup. So now for comparative advantage, this will be 2/3, and he will make 1.5 cakes for 1 pie. And then for Joe, it will be 1.25 and 0.8, and this will leave Brett with the comparative advantage in cakes and Joe with the comparative advantage in pies, because they have the lower opportunity cost, meaning they will make more with their time.